Good evening, and welcome to the first of many courageous conversations on advancing anti-racism in Santa Monica. Hi, I'm Barry Snell, and along with the City of Santa Monica, in conjunction with community members of the Black Agenda and the Santa Monica Black Lives Association, a nonprofit company, we have put together this evening forum, which I hope will begin the tough, difficult discussions on systemic racism as it pertains to Santa Monica residents. Before I begin, it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the mayor of Santa Monica, Sue Hemmerich.
Thank you, Barry. And I appreciate the introduction. I am so happy to be able to be present and engaged in our first community conversation. I hope, as Barry said, that it is the first of many, and I'm particularly happy to introduce the Mayor Pro Tem of Santa Monica, Kristen McCowan, who is the first African-American woman to serve on our city council and the first African-American pro tem of the city of Santa Monica. So, Kristen, welcome.
Thank you, Sue. Hello, everyone. Tonight is an important night for Santa Monica. It's the beginning of many necessary conversations about how we as a community can unite to begin undoing the havoc that supremacy and racism has wreaked on our community and communities around the world for hundreds of years. Last year, we all witnessed the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. We heard the news reports about the murders of Breonna Taylor and far too many others. Community members in Santa Monica and around the world took to the streets to declare that all Black lives matter and demand an end to the racism and white supremacy that leads to the continuous murder and adverse life outcomes of far too many of our Black brothers and sisters. I'm proud that the Santa Monica City Council recognized the immediate need to look inward and address the inequities faced by the Black community right here in our small city. After hearing the outcry from Santa Monica's Black community last year, and meeting with community leaders and ally organizations, the city supported the creation of a Black agenda to help address the concerns of the Black community in Santa Monica. As a country and society, we have much work to do to address systemic racism and the seemingly strong resistance to progressive and thoughtful change, as was evidenced by the recent insurrection that unfolded at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Having an open and honest conversation and educating ourselves about the social, economic, and political impacts of white supremacy and racism is critical to begin our healing and recovery process. I'm hopeful about our future because you have joined us tonight with open minds and hearts to discuss how we can work together to address the symptoms of the legacy of white supremacy, the lingering damage of racist policies, and how to move our community forward. As the mother of two young multiracial children, and in solidarity with all parents raising our next generation, I'm hopeful for a future where race does not predict the outcome of one's life. With that, I would like to turn it over to Angela Scott. Angela is a member of the Santa Monica Black Agenda. She is a community activist and is very involved in Santa Monica. She sits on several committees, including the Public Safety Reform Advisory Committee, the Committee for Racial Justice Steering Committee, and the Steering Committee of the Community for Excellent Public Schools, SEPS. She also provides input to our Economic Recovery Task Force on local hiring and job training. Angela is a City Arts Commissioner. She's a mother and a friend. Please welcome Angela Scott.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem McCowan. I am blessed and honored to be in this space with such activists, entrepreneurs, innovators, creators, healers, and community members. And in this space, we have our Black Agenda Steering Committee members who are, as you heard earlier, Santa Monica College Board Trustee Barry Snell, retired Santa Monica College professor and principal of Gunn Consulting, Dr. Karen Gunn, community activist and CEO founder of Black Santa Monica Tours, Ms. Robbie Jones, Santa Monica's first Black mayor, Mr. Santa Monica himself, Nat Travis, certified holistic lifestyle coach, Raina Kirkland, community activist and downtown Santa Monica Commissioner, Erica Leslie, and recently appointed Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District school member, Keith Coleman. And I saved the best for last, Ms. Kiera Blades Snell. She was born in Belize and migrated to Tampa, Florida in 2009. Kiera holds a master's degree from University of South Florida in hospitality management and is a certified life and business coach. She's currently owner of Blades and Associates, a full-service marketing agency. partner of Javi International, and co-founder of Santa Monica Black Lives Association. She's also founder and president of Dreams Come True nonprofit, director of member services for Santa Monica Rotary Club, and board member for Santa Monica History Museum, chair of the Gala Committee. Kiera has a passion for helping others, and as you have a problem saying no. Prior to seeing Kiera, we're going to watch a brief video, and then after the video, we will meet Kiera Blade Snell. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, Delana, and thank you to the City of Santa Monica for hosting this forum. On June 9th, the Santa Monica City Council added a 13th item requesting community support to create a Black agenda to address systemic racism in Santa Monica and to implement the Black agenda for the Santa Monica community. Santa Monica members met to discuss the framework for a Black agenda for the Santa Monica. We had weekly meetings, consist of about 25 Black community members, and we created a mind map to help us develop a survey of 29 questions relating to economic development, housing and homelessness, education, mental health and wellness, and police reform. The survey was prepared and we sent it out to Black residents, Black employers, employees, and students over 18. The survey was left open for 2 weeks, and at closing, we had received 238 responses. From our survey, almost 62% of the respondents considered the importance of creating a nonprofit specifically dedicated to providing services, resources, and assistance to the Black community of Santa Monica as highest priority. The Black agenda then prepared and presented to the City Council requesting assistance to start a nonprofit, which is now today Santa Monica Black Lives Association, or as we call it, SMBLA. I am proud that SMBLA is a California registered 501c3. SMBLA is a multi-service community-based agency that addresses the health, wellness, mental health, and socioeconomic needs of the Black community. We offer direct and indirect services designed to improve the quality of life, personal resilience, spiritual foundation of the Black Santa Monica community members. We help Black residents cope with the impact of systemic racism, and we create a climate for non-Black community members to learn and acknowledge the part many have played in the ongoing systemic racism towards Black people in our community. We also provide a space for listening and learning so non-Black community members can become better informed on what racism and implicit biases are, and we work together to eradicate them from our community. As you know, SMBLA is a newly formed agency, and we do need community support. Please visit our website, smbla.org, to learn more about our mission and vision. Subscribe to our newsletter so you can keep up with our progresses, challenges, and even our events. And speaking of events, we actually have a free poetry and jazz event for youth Saturday at 3 p.m. You can register for this event either on our website or on Facebook. Please like, share, and follow us on our social media platforms. Santa Monica Black Lives Association. And also invite your family, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues to follow and like as well. And always remember to click share. If you have any questions or concern or need assistance, email us at info@smbla.org. To our business owners and Santa Monica-based organizations, I say, contact us. We would love to partner with you. We can help and provide training and also assist in creating your organization's DEI policies and procedures. The Black population of Santa Monica is only 4%, but I can assure you, our love for the city is more than 100%. On behalf of SMBLA and the Black Agenda, I would like to thank you for your attention and your support. We look forward to working alongside you to ensure a better Santa Monica for all. It really takes a village, but in our case, it takes a city. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Nakia Fields. Nakia Fields is an author, speaker, and founder of the Therapeutic Play Foundation, a nonprofit that seeks to build a healthier, more resilient world for those in under-resourced communities. Nakia is active in the community as a chair of the Black Mental Health Task Force, which seeks to empower community members of Black and African heritage through advocacy and policy reform. Ladies and gentlemen, Nakia T. Fields.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the City of Santa Monica and the Black Agenda for the opportunity to be heard. It's my honor to present a piece I wrote entitled Self-Care as Radical Protest, published in a 2020 edition of the Pasadena Black Faces magazine. Self-care as radical protest. We are so productive. We can multitask and handle it all. We've got this. We are strong. We are able. We are damn near superhuman with our ability to make the best out of the worst situation. We are often placed in the path of harm, and our trauma response is to expect it and accept it, because when we resist, we are labeled as thugs and criminals. Better to just take it, and survive it. In this cage that America built, life becomes just surviving, one day bleeding into another. We become numb and in survival mode, our primary motivation being pleasure to drown out the pain and competing for resources to get our basic needs met. Sometimes even intentionally tearing each other down to get what's ours individually. Survival of the fittest, not building together. Villages destroyed, culture interrupted. Knowing from our history with Black Wall Street in Tulsa and Seneca Village in New York, that when we are able to attain a community and it is prosperous, danger lies near. This hard-ass life of work, and more work. Labor, and more labor. Numbing ourselves to the reality that we are not truly living as we could be, as was intended by our Creator. We see others with more means and safety, living with no care as to what can happen to their bodies and families, seemingly free of our burdens. They are not like us, moving through milestones, lackadaisical and ignorant to what it's like to be Black. We witness them having the privilege of just being. To be in the community pool or park without harassment is our type of luxury. Ah, the life. To be Black is to experience colorism and the assignment of value based on hue and brown paper bags. So disposable and useful, those brown paper bags. To be Black is to see injustice in someone who looks like you dying in front of you on the regular, and knowing deep down that you or someone you love could be next. To be Black is to know that our behaviors are policed by law enforcement and society alike. We can't be mad, we can't be sad, we can't be silent. When we are either, we get labeled as the angry, mean, antisocial Black employee, unable to have a bad day. To be Black is go to the doctor and leave feeling unheard and uncared for, worried that anything you shared will result in pain and suffering for your family. To be Black is to feel sick and to be told you are not. Performance skills on high to keep that job and keep that food on the table and to keep children in our care. To be Black is to deny our truth, to restrict our voice, to show up with masks on in order to get to a certain status. To be Black means that just like with that brown paper bag, we are disposable to some. To be Black is to compete for resources and to experience the need to code switch when we get around mixed company. To be Black is to experience being confused with another Black person in the organization just because there are only a few of you. To be Black is to feel isolated in our aloneness when we make it into rooms we thought we were supposed to be in, people treating us as if we are lucky, like we won the lotto, and not because we are amazing creatures who have beaten unsurmountable odds and climbed our way there. And still we work with a smile and a little dance. We are productive and we are lazy if we rest. It's almost as if our ancestors were taught long ago and passed down the thought that most of our worth resided in our ability to do labor, to get things done, to be of service. This teacher, this educator of what is expected of living life while Black is long gone, but the gatekeepers remain. The lesson remains. The message remains. Keep working. Stop taking breaks. Serve. The time of enslaved minds to the thought that service and productivity is what brings us value is over. We must claim a change in thought. We must engage in self-care as a form of radical protest. As Audre Lorde stated, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. We must address the extreme inflammation of our nervous systems by giving it a chance to rest and return to a parasympathetic space. We must pause so that the toxic stress of our bodies are constantly feeling can be addressed. We must remove ourselves from the chaos that we subconsciously create in our behavior patterns that keep us in that fear response. We must let go of stigma around love, affection, and caring for mental, physical, and spiritual health first. We must share when we feel ill, sad, or down, and not just power through. We are so used to the fear and adrenaline that comes from strife that at times we welcome it as the norm. After all, living while Black is to be alert and aware and prepared for danger at all times. Will our survival skills get muted if we don't constantly practice running from the giant dinosaur that represents the specter of our oppression? Imagine if we let that go. Imagine if we attained feelings of safety within ourselves and our communities. Imagine if we created routines of wellness and intentionally operated as our most actualized selves in a uniform and strategic way because we feel well enough to do so. What if we connected and powered ourselves forward beyond just basic needs and into comfort for more than a select few? What if we stepped out of intentionally placed lessons of fear and shed that old belief of where our value lies? The possibilities are endless when we are optimistic. We must first believe change is possible in order to step forward and demand it. To be Black is to be worthy of rejuvenation and restoration. Let's commit to healing enough to require it as our due. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakia. Powerful. And now I get to introduce Dr. Karen S Gunn, who has worked over 35 years in Los Angeles area in higher education, health, and mental health services. She was a tenured professor at Santa Monica College, during which time she served as chair of the psychology department. Karen received her doctorate in community and organizational psychology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. In addition to her work in higher education, she has been a small business owner as principal of Gunn Consulting Group, an organizational and management development entity for over 35 years. Gunn Consulting has provided extensive assistance, consultation, and training to private and nonprofit and government organizations. Primary focus and expertise involves human resources and management, executive development, diversity and inclusion, and equity initiatives, team building, impersonal communication, and organizational training. Dr. Gunn is highly regarded as a trainer, facility, coach, and motivational speaker. She has served as a board member and chair of many nonprofit agencies and community organizations. The volunteer work has included chairman of the Hollywood Sunset Free Clinic Board and directors, membership in various advocacy and social justice groups, member of the Venice Family Clinic Board of Directors, and advisory board member and chairman of the Santa Monica Social Services and Commission and recently served 4 years as chairwoman of the Santa Monica Bay Area in Human Relations Council, and a friend to me and our family in Santa Monica. Without further ado, Dr. Karen Gunn.
All right. Thank you, Barry. I should be here. What's happening? I hope you can hear me. I can see me.
We can hear you.
Okay, but you can see me as well? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It was great to hear all of the opening remarks from members of our steering committee. I want to also, again, as a part of the steering committee, say thank you to the City of Santa Monica for supporting us, to have the mayor and the mayor pro tem with us this evening, to the City Council as well. And I want to give a shout out to a couple of people that you don't see, but without whom this would not be a successful run. And that is Delana Benakama and David, who are behind the scenes making everything work. To Sister Nakia Fields, who I work with, we're fellow advocates. You brought the spoken word, and I appreciate that. Let me begin with a couple of announcements, because I want to make sure that everyone understands there is going to be some time for question and answering after the two presenters, Ms. Erica D. Smith and Mr. Earl Ofari Hutchinson, have spoken. We're going to have some time. We want to hear from the community. We want the community to have a chance to ask some questions and share their comments. We also have a poll at the end, just before our closing remarks. There are only 3 questions. They will occur in a sequence. I really hope everyone will stick around towards the end and let us know what you thought about the event, if you have any interest in attending another one in the future, and the value of this evening. So as just before I introduce our speakers, I thought I would take a minute. The first one is to acknowledge the loss of 2 incredible women who are part of our entertainment arts over the last 24 hours. We lost Miss Cicely Tyson earlier today, I believe at the age of 96, an Emmy and Oscar winner. We also lost Cloris Leachman. And so it is really good at this moment to just take a minute and recognize. I'm not going to have a moment of silence, but I think it's important to acknowledge the passing of these 2 incredible women who lived long and productive lives. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to take a moment. I didn't get permission, so I'll have to express my apologies if people are upset. But after January 20th, listening to one of our own homegrown young ladies, a genius of words, almost steal the show and the stage from Lady Gaga, Jennifer Lopez, President Biden, and Vice President Harris, Miss Amanda Gorman. I just fully appreciated her words. I'm sure most of you have even gotten a copy of her poem that you read that day. I want to borrow and patch together just a few of those words before we move into a presentation from our speakers. And they are as follows. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. It, to me, the words reflect, I believe, the hope and the desires, the courage, the struggle, the progress that those of us that are part of the Black Agenda embrace, that I believe the city respects and recognizes. And so I'm really proud to be a part of the steering committee, to be a member of a founding member. And at this moment, let me move into my introduction. You're going to first hear from Ms. Erica D. Smith, followed by Mr. Earl Ofari Hutchinson. Ms. Smith is an award-winning columnist with the LA Times, formerly their assistant Metro editor. She's had a focus on diversity, housing, homelessness, police reform, social justice, health disparities. Before coming to the LA Times, she worked for the Sacramento Bee and then the Indianapolis Star. I dug deep, my sister. The Akron Beacon Journal, and she's a native of Cleveland. Mr. Hutchinson, who will follow her, is also an award-winning journalist, nationally recognized author. He has written over 10 books. He is a contributor to the LA Times and many other publications and magazines, as well as CNN and the Huffington Post. Mr. Hutchinson also hosts a weekly radio show on KPFK called, wait for it, The Hutchinson Report. And he is the founder of the Los Angeles Urban Policy Roundtable. Mr. Hutchinson is a Chicago-born brother. So we're bringing the Midwest to the left coast, and we're doing the best. Let me turn it over to Ms. Erica D. Smith. Welcome, my sister.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's actually quite the honor, especially not being a native Californian. But, I was thinking about just the Black Agenda and the many things that are a part of it, and they overlap so much with what I've been covering since being at the LA Times and before that at the Sacramento Bee, as you mentioned. But thinking about where we are at this moment, last year was so many awful things happened last year. It was just this endless year of things. But I think within that awfulness presented a huge opportunity. And obviously we have that with the Black Agenda. But I think that, one of the biggest things going forward, for Santa Monica and I think for Black Americans overall and for Californians is just having a presidential administration that's going to be, on the side of the things that are in that agenda and advances that we want to champion. Just having that ability to partner with the federal government, I think, is going to make a huge bit of difference. And also having, of course, Kamala Harris as vice president from California. But I think a few areas that are in the agenda that I think are probably ripe for, advancement that were rolled back under the previous, presidential administration. Police reform, that's a huge part of the agenda. It's a big part of what led to the protests last year after George Floyd. But it also is a big part of why I think so many Americans are interested in racial justice right now. And I think capitalizing on that interest in the mainstream and not just among African Americans is important. So I think, already Biden has reinstated federal investigations and oversight for police departments, for consent decrees. The Trump administration had pretty much stopped paying attention to those consent decrees, which allowed police departments to just do kind of whatever they wanted to, know it free of repercussions. And so having that hammer back, I think, is going to make hopefully a big bit of difference. Also, the Biden administration has followed suit with California did in ending its reliance on private prisons, which I think we all kind of are for in terms of like having an industry out of incarcerating Black and brown men is not okay. I think that both of those go towards the part of the agenda that's in the use of force policies and community-oriented policing, which I think are very important for communities to know their police officers and to have more of an emphasis on that. Obviously, LA PD, not Santa Monica, cut the budget for the police department, but I imagine that with crime spiking, mostly because of COVID and the economy, I think there's going to be a pressure to kind of push back on that and to refund a lot of these police departments who are screaming about lack of funding, saying there's they don't have the manpower to deal with problems. And I think that, part of the issue that I think we're going to have to deal with is trying to stand up and say, putting money back into police forces is kind of where we are now. And so how do you navigate that, knowing that violent crime is up in many cities, including Los Angeles, and also saying that we're going to continue to cut police force and put that money into more community resources. I think that's going to be a big ask and a big burden for 2021 and going forward. Another area that's in the agenda that I think everybody's passionate about, particularly in California, but definitely in LA, is housing and homelessness. That's, an issue that it exists everywhere. It exists when I was in the Midwest, but it is so overwhelming here in California, and particularly in Los Angeles. And I think we've all seen, I live on the West Side as well. I mean, we've all seen the uptick in homelessness as the pandemic has ravaged the country and the state. And so I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think most of us know that housing prices, despite all of this, are still going through the roof. Rental prices at the higher end have come down somewhat, but not dramatically so. So, I mean, we still are facing the same housing crunch and problems that we've had. On the upside, we do have a Black woman, Marsha Fudge, who's from Cleveland, who is now in charge of HUD, assuming will be confirmed to be in charge of HUD. And already the Biden administration has kind of started to reenact to kind of promote equitable housing policies that the former Secretary Ben Carson has stripped away, and basically just kind of acknowledges the role that the federal government played in redlining and racial covenants, which all of us know so well. So having that kind of acknowledgement and awareness is going to be a big deal and super important. But I think in the homelessness front, we obviously have to deal with the situation on the ground and expanding hotel, Project Roomkey, which is the governor and the county's initiative to get homeless people into hotel rooms, is going to be super important, as well as dealing with, other issues, given the fact that the pandemic, at least at this moment, doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon. So, these are all policies, again, that with the upheaval last year, there's suddenly more of an interest in trying to tackle them. I mean, we got more homeless people off the street in 6 months last year than we probably have in years, simply because there was an urgency and a need to do so because of COVID-19. So maintaining that both at the state and federal levels, but particularly at the local level, is going to be really important. But I do think there's a huge opportunity to do that. Again, housing prices, gentrification, that's going to be a tough one, but those all have to be tackled. And I think, the plans that are in the agenda about establishing rent-to-own units kind of address, people who can't afford anything, myself included, basically being able to buy property. So that's going to be important. But, one of the things I wrote about that's happening in Compton is guaranteed income project, which is kind of followed on the heels of what Stockton did a couple of years ago, which they're giving, but it's on a much bigger scale. They're giving basically between $300 and $600 to about, I think it's 800 residents over 2 years to see what that looks like. Now, most of us, up until a few years ago, nobody really wanted to do anything with guaranteed income or universal basic income, figuring it was like a handout. But I think with stimulus checks and the economy in shambles, it opens a new opportunity to really address poverty and just inequities in economic justice in a way that we probably haven't before. So, I mean, those are some of the things that I was, thinking about. I'm happy to expound upon any of those things, but I do think that what Santa Monica is doing is extremely important. I think that the trick, after covering, and I'm sure Earl can talk to this as well, covering so many cities that have tried to come together to implement anti-racist policies and to do major things, I think the trick is always maintaining that momentum. I was in Sacramento after, some of you might remember Stephon Clark, who was shot in his backyard by police from holding a cell phone. That was something that, Sacramento, people in LA, when they protest, they shut the freeway down all the time. They don't shut down the freeway in Sacramento. So that was a big deal. But it was an even bigger deal for, them to shut down an NBA game. Actually, I think 2 of them. And so it was impressive, actually, particularly for Sacramento. But, unfortunately, I think what happened in that arc, what came out of that was a lot of momentum, a lot of people from different parts of that community that never really spoke that much that came together for a common cause. And there were some great organizations that came out of it, a partnership with the Sacramento Kings to invest money into Black-owned businesses. Among them, there was more partnerships with the city. But I think the unfortunate thing is over time, I think some of those bonds began to break. Fiefdoms resurfaced. People had different ideas about what change should be. They couldn't kind of rally around the same set of goals that was allowed. They rallied around enough goals together to get the governor to sign a pretty substantial use of force bill in Sacramento that we all still have today. But I think the challenges for any of these types of groups, and your group included, is just maintaining the momentum after the initial push and the raw. And so that's something to really, I think, really to think about, just as I said, just recovering, cities coming together and people coming together with well intentions. But how do you not just, deal with something 6 months from now, but what does it look like 6 years from now? Because we all know these problems are entrenched and are going to take a while to solve. So that's my talk. That's my thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Smith, and I'm sure we'll circle back. I'm glad now to turn the stage over, if you will, to Mr. Earl Ofari Hutchinson. Please share your wisdom, drop some knowledge for us. Welcome.
Well, okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, we're fine. We can hear you. Me? And we can see you with all those books and everything. I think you need an organizational psychologist behind you. Yeah, but we can see.
Okay, well, you can see something. Okay. Anyway, I think it's a great event and a great undertaking from the city of Santa Monica. I think you are really setting a standard with this. In fact, the standard that the city of Los Angeles would be wanting to follow in terms of really opening things up, really having the dialogue, really having the engagement. And with technology now, you can be in the comfort of your home and you can talk to the world. I think it's really great. So, as Erica said, she covered, a lot of the political and public policy areas: education, health, welfare, homelessness, police accountability, police misconduct, abuse. But one of the things when I think about where we're going forward with a Black agenda, I go back in time when former President Barack Obama took office. I do remember that almost every year he was hit with one thing: what are you doing for African Americans? Where is the Black agenda? And he would patiently explain, look, fact is, I'm president of all the people, not just Black people. So there's not going to be any one agenda for any one group. And the issue came up a lot when it talked, especially when a lot of community leaders, activists, and others, including occasionally myself, would ask the question. We've got this, let's just take one public policy area, which is always in any season a major crisis issue. The absolute, devastating issue of young Black males unemployed. And we know when that's the case, you can see many of the problems that stem from that. So the challenge was always, look, part of the Black agenda is do something extra, do something special, do something above and beyond just providing general programs for the general public, the young African American males that are suffering mightily. Well, the president would always explain, that we're putting economic programs together, jobs, education, training, and a number of other things too, that essentially would essentially address some of that. But then that wasn't enough, because we have special needs and special problems above and beyond just the general public, even those of other ethnic groups. So the thing as we move forward now, Biden, I think about that and I put Obama as a backdrop. You've got a guy now, just based on the last few days, signed more than 40 executive orders. 4 or 5 of them have dealt specifically with racial equity, racial justice issues. And I think now there's a window that's open. Biden is not handicapped like Obama was, because in a sense it was an upside and a downside. He was handicapped, and he was boosted by race, because when I say handicap, if you're the appearance that you're tilting toward blacks, there's going to be a backlash. Obama had that issue that he had to deal with. So he was juggling and walking a tightrope. But Biden doesn't do that and doesn't have that. So there's several openings there, a big window of opportunity now for Black agenda in all the public policy areas. Biden can be held accountable. Number one, he wouldn't be in the Oval Office if it wasn't for the African American vote, and even more specifically, African American females, not only in Georgia, but many other places that came out in record numbers and supported him across the board. Given this history, given this background, and given this administration, and given the political constructs of where they are, I think he understands that. He understands that from his appointments, and understands that too from the kind of things he's going to inside. So, with the Black agenda, looking at all the public policy areas, education, right at the top, jobs, very close to that, the economy. I think we mentioned housing / homelessness, and certainly when you look at FLA, two things we see. The streets look like Calcutta here. And not only that, the majority of those that you see in the streets that look like Calcutta look like you and I, African American in many cases. So all the public policy areas, I think, are open now. And even at the state level, Erica, you mentioned could be done. We can't leave out local and state officials and policymakers. I think Newsom, who essentially has some presidential ambitions down the line, I think he gets some of the things that have to be done, whether the whole range of issues from homelessness, jobs, education, and police accountability. But I think none of this is going to happen. And I mean, I can't emphasize this enough, unless there's something that we have to put back in our vocabulary, a word that has been, actually two words, that's been missing a long time. The first word, accountability. The second word is transparency. Doesn't do any good. You can have the greatest agenda in the world, but if you're not willing to hold their feet to the fire, you're not willing to hold everyone from Newsom through Biden all the way down to the mayor of Santa Monica and all points in between, elected officials. If you're not willing to hold their feet to the fire, get in their face, put that agenda there, pound on them, remind them, you know, we're a major part of your constituency. There are resources there that we must have in all of the chronic public policy areas and public policy issues and problems. I think that the second thing is transparency. The big problem that we have is too many of our elected officials, oftentimes, and we have to be critical too, many of them are Black. They come before us and they ask for our vote. But then you have to ask yourself, in between 2 or 4 years you do that, what are you doing? What do we know what you're doing in Sacramento when bills are being introduced, when initiatives are being presented? Do we know that? How do you send newsletters? Do you have emails? Do you have viral town halls? What are you doing? So it's a two-way street when you're talking about presenting an agenda. Doesn't mean anything if you're not prepared to go that extra step and hold their feet to the fire. Now, you know, you've got several hundred people in Santa Monica that essentially, I'm looking at the numbers now, you got 200 people here tonight. That's almost an army. You know, if they're mobilized and they're energized and they're focused and they stay on point on the different agenda items and demand transparency, accountability. So, you know, I think these are just some of the things that going forward we have to think about. How can we hold them accountable? How can we present the Black agenda in a very laser focused way? And most importantly, when we do that, how do we get results?
Thank you so very much. And, you know, you both have laid out some very important facts as well as some questions, I think, that we can take as a community, our elected officials can think about, and the Black agenda can also consider. And so as I'd said, we're going to have an opportunity for the community to ask you all some questions. But I want to throw a question at you, and I'm going to see if I can do it as well as I can. I just finished reading Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of the things that he talks about is precisely what I think both of you have mentioned, that we have to look at changing policies. And that means holding people accountable if those policies fall short of what the needs are in the community. He also said essentially that he's kind of lost patience with being able to convince people who don't recognize their privilege that they should be morally indignant. He's done with the pictures of Emmett Till's open casket, for example, strange fruit that Billie Holiday sang about, because he's kind of figuring we've done quite a bit of that, and the moral center hasn't really changed much. And he's also kind of not convinced that giving people data is necessarily going to change their minds either. So how do we get to the real policy change, to move from just demonstrations, which he also thinks are sort of like drop in the bucket things, to protests that lead to policies? Now, I'm not suggesting I buy into all of what he's saying, but he has some provocative ideas. Do either one of you have any response to that? It sounds like you do, Earl. Hit it.
Well, I do. Erica?
Please.
Yeah, I do. You can go first, Earl. It's okay.
Well, when you talk, let's circle back on the point about accountability, because the second part to that is, how do you measure accountability in terms of changing public policy and moving the public policy arrow forward? One thing we can sometimes learn from the opposite, the other side, those that are definitely on the other side. I keep always mindful of what the Tea Party did. What they did was they wanted the Republican Party to move them to the right, if you can believe that, even further to the right. And so what they did was they didn't go after Democrats. They went after other Republicans and said, what we're going to do is we have an agenda. And they laid out their agenda. It was a hard right-wing conservative agenda. They laid it out there, and they said, if you do not support that agenda, we're going to punish you at the polls. We are going to mobilize against you, and we're going to even run alternative candidates, other Republicans against you in primaries. So what they did was they had their agenda. They had all the item points that they wanted, they were pushing. And essentially, they challenged within the party. They were not concerned about Democrats. They didn't care about us. They were concerned with their people, getting them on board agenda. So, there's some models that we can learn from the South. I've always just felt this. We have a number of African-American elected officials. They know the problems. I mean, we've laid them out a gazillion times, for crying out loud. But the question is, when it comes to something like, say, we'll just pick an issue, and the one that's always in any season right before us, Black lives, and protecting and ensuring Black lives, and essentially police departments, to be brutally frank, stopping them from killing us. You do that. Well, the fact of the matter is they are political animals too. They respond to the political currents and the winds. So what has to be done is you have to challenge those elected officials that essentially they serve at their pleasure, are appointed by them, or in some cases they actually are politicians too, like the sheriff of LA County. They have a run for this. So the thing is, you have to challenge them. Put the agenda in front of them. You lay it out. Should be very consistent, very concise. And by the way, you don't need a lot of people. We have done so many activist things over the years. Sometimes it's just 3 or 4 people. It's not how many troops that you have. It's how many troops the enemy thinks you have. How many people that they feel that you can mobilize and make sure that accountability is there. So I'm just simply saying this. There are many avenues and there are many opportunities going forward to essentially get the measure of who these elected officials are, put an agenda in front of them, and not all at once, but picking and choosing things that are very, very important. Strategy and timeliness is very important. And then essentially circling back on them, giving them a time. You got 2 weeks. What did you do about that? Or did you do anything about that? And if you didn't, we're going to come at you. We're going to come at you.
Ms. Smith, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond as well.
Sure. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Earl's saying, but, I'm also a realist. I mean, my dad was a lobbyist, so I grew up tripping over politicians. And, I've also a newer Californian, and and after living in the very red state of Indiana for 10 years, there's one thing that's very true, is that there's things you can do in very liberal, overwhelmingly liberal California that you can't do national. And I think that, I think that there's a lot of things that we can do, kind of taking the AOC model of I'm going to primary you if you don't give me what I want, that's going to work a lot better in California, where The Democrats control basically all of government and we don't have enough real Republicans, so Democrats fight amongst themselves here. And the state is overwhelmingly left leaning, then you can do something that's nationally. I mean, I think even with something like police reform, when you start talking about quote unquote defunding the police, you have a lot of Black people in other states that don't agree with that, where maybe in California, the large majority do, because whether it's a misunderstanding of the concept, whether it's, whatever it may be, I mean, I think that there's just, Black people, as we all know, are not a monolith. And so I think it's a little bit harder to say, we want you to do all of these things that are on our agenda nationally, when nationally there may not be that consensus. So that gives those politicians the ability to be like, oh, whatever, go do your thing, because you're not going to get rid of me, because there are enough moderate voters or more right-leaning Democrats that will reelect them. So I think it's about strategy. I think it's about picking the right policies to do that with. I do agree with Earl about you have to go after Democrats in the way that the Tea Party did. I mean, granted, we could also take a lesson from the Republican Party that if we go after them and the party goes that far left, we could end up with something the equivalent of what the Republicans have on the right, which might not be a good thing either. But but I think there's definitely some strategies and to take and to do some things that are differently than just kind of going along to get along, which I think is what African Americans have been doing for decades.
Thank you. So let me, I want to give a heads up to everyone who's in attendance that we are going to move towards some Q&A and some commentary momentarily, but I have another question I'd like to throw at both of you, and either one of you respond if you'd like. You're talking about strategy, holding people accountable, tapping or focusing on a variety of priorities that are deeply entrenched, that are going to be hard to reverse, even in a more liberal state like California. Dealing with homelessness and the high percentage of African Americans that are there living without housing, changing the economic environment. How many cities are going to do what Compton has dared to do? I could imagine, and this is just me, if we turn to set this to the city of Santa Monica at this moment, there may be either crickets or I'm not sure what else. So which leads me to any comments you have about the importance of coalitions to address some of the issues and priorities you've talked about and the problems in society. Is that important? Is it a strategy or a piece of a strategy so that folks work together who are dealing with similar problems and historical background? Any comment on that at all?
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, I think coalitions are very important when they make sense. I mean, I think, trying to force a coalition just to do something may not be the best method, because then that can cause problems down the road when, people's interests splinter. And it, by the time you try to come up with a clear message to get a policy enacted, there's no clear message anymore. But I do think on entrenched issues like homelessness, for example, which is of course overlaid with systemic racism, like everything else is, everywhere, but particularly in California, you're not going to really be able to address that problem without somehow dealing with the housing developers, dealing with the, tenants' rights activists, dealing with, the police who are oftentimes called to deal with homeless encampments, to dealing with, there's so many factors in that massive problem if you just want to take homelessness, to be able to really deal with it in any sort of substantive way. And then, of course, whatever happens in Santa Monica, I mean, Santa Monica is not an island, and, there's homeless people all over LA County. So, I mean, there has to be some sort of coalition to deal with some of these more entrenched problems. I think that there is, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, I do think that because of the upheaval of 2020, I do think there's more interest right now from beyond just Black people, but Americans in general, to kind of tackle some of these bigger problems. And I think that the goal should be to strike kind of while the iron's hot, while people are interested, while people are willing to do something that they weren't willing to do, say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or maybe they may not be anti-racist, but they might be more open-minded to hearing why they might be, should be. You know, there's certain things that have like opened a crack. And I think if there's a way to kind of lodge that and to parlay that into a coalition that makes sense to attack a big policy, I think it's important.
Okay, it's a different way to think about crack than what we have in the past. Mr. Hutchinson, please.
Well, I'm going to go back to, was it April or May? Sometimes we get these senior moments. So, you know, the way time goes, I'm not always sure. Somewhere back in the spring, I left the station, do my radio show at KPFK, Pacifica Radio, on Saturdays. So when I left the station coming back to Inglewood, got off the freeway, the Harbor Freeway at USC. It took me about 45 minutes to get across Figueroa at USC. Why did it take 45 minutes to get across the street that you can get across in 45 seconds? I'll tell you why. Something I never thought I would see. I saw what looked like the United Nations, Asian Americans, Hispanics, definitely, I mean, young whites, not a lot of blacks, but primarily every ethnic group that you want to see and imagine. Thousands of them were walking down Figueroa with Black Lives Matter banners, buttons, signs, and everything. I never thought I would see anything like that in my lifetime. I mean, you'd have to go back to the civil rights movement. But even there, it wasn't quite the same. It wasn't as structured. But this one, the issue, and you had a massive coalition, literally thousands of people that spanned every kind of ethnic, religious, occupational group that you want. And the beautiful thing about it is the overwhelming majority of them were young. That told me one thing right there. Yes, you can build coalitions. Yes, you can bring a lot of people together. And in this case, what was even more interesting, ostensibly a black issue, that you had so many others that were willing to engage on that. So that told me right there when you asked the question about coalitions. We've always had coalitions. We've always emphasized that going all the way back to Dr. King. I mean, the whole civil rights movement was built on coalitions with other groups. So I saw that again, fast forwarding almost a half a century later. So any of the public policy issues that we pick, I think you can always find advocates there on the other side. You would be well advised to essentially seek them out, build those coalitions, and essentially present as great a united front as you can across the spectrum. When that happens, there's so much power, even more power in that unity.
Well, thank you so much. And in fact, again, let me remind everyone who's in attendance that on the right-hand side of your screen, there's something that says Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in there for either Mr. Hutchinson or Ms. Smith or both. We've gotten one question, and it sounds as though it could be either for the Black Agenda members that are here, but it could be also a consideration for both of you. And it is about whether the Black and Latino struggles are interconnected, and if we as Black Agenda people need to address it. Is there anything that you would add to what you've already said, Mr. Hutchinson, about this question, or Ms. Smith? The interconnectedness of Black and Latino or Latinx community?
Well, okay. We live in Southern California, and we know the brutal reality. African Americans, it's a vis-a-vis Hispanic Americans, Latinos. We're almost, we're not going to say insignificant in numbers, but it's certainly, we pale in comparison to them. So always the thing is picking issues, and there are a number of them. Let me just remind you of something that happened back in, again, the spring, when the Sheriff's Department gunned down a young Hispanic, and there were demonstrations all over the place. You had a number of African Americans that joined in So you did have an informal black-brown coalition around a police violent act. When there was a young African American that gunned down a month or so later, you had a number of Latinos and others that came out and joined in on the issue of police abuse, police misconduct, police violence. So I think when whatever the issue is, homelessness, especially jobs, and especially resources. Yes, I know there's always competition. Yes, I know that, the battle back and forth. Yes, there's always political jock and ethnic jockeying. But I think that there are enough individuals, certainly of a progressive bent, that understand the importance of coming together on specific issues. I think the key thing to make it happen, though, is who's going to lead it? Who's going to initiate that? Is there a leader or leaders? Are there point people out there that can bring the people together? It's not just enough having a willingness. You got to have people that are willing to take the initiative on it, so I think make it happen.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, would you like to respond?
I agree with Earl about, we live in Southern California. It has to be a coalition. But it made me think about now Supervisor Holly Mitchell and the campaign that she ran to be county supervisor. Same with, when she was a state senator. I mean, she very much ran on this idea of a Black and Latino coalition. And, I'm not sure if she's the leader that, we need, but I think there are people out there who do understand and have cred in all communities enough to be able to kind of help lead this coalition. And I think that it's just part of living in California, I think.
Yeah, and so I appreciate both of the things that you're saying and the importance. I can't speak, and I won't speak for the Black Agenda because I'm just one of a singular member. But certainly the importance of leaders in both communities reaching out to try to build that bridge, I think, is an important takeaway from what you're saying. I'm not sure if there are any other questions right now in the queue, and waiting to see if there are. Let me see if I can pose another question. One of the things the Black Agenda has talked about is the need to grow Black businesses in the city of Santa Monica and to change the matrix of who's there, who owns businesses, and also facilitate that growth by looking at policies in the financial industry, in the banking industry, when it comes to loans, when it comes to opportunities for real estate, and those kinds of things. How important is that in your view? And are there any ideas you have about strategies or issues that we might need to address to make that change, to improve that landscape so that there are more entrepreneurs that are here in our city? Any suggestions, ideas, challenges? Get it, Ms. Smith? I see you shaking your head.
I do think that it's important. I mean, I think, self-sufficiency, economic sufficiency, economic justice are all, crucial issues, particularly because becoming a business owner as a Black person is difficult because of, securing loans. And I forget the percentage, but it's very high about the number of entrepreneurs that started their businesses that are Black based on money that they got from friends and family or they had, and they put literally their life savings into it, which makes, part of what makes seeing the way the pandemic has wreaked havoc on small businesses what makes it so painful. I read a statistic, something like the pandemic has taken out like 50% of small Black owned businesses in the country, I think, since last year. So, it's very important. I think that, and I know that there's some fundraising going on. Maybe it's creating, working with the Chamber of Commerce to have some sort of special fund to help entrepreneurs get started. Maybe it's working with the existing Black owned businesses, entrepreneurs to kind of help kind of daisy chain to build off of one another. I think one of the things that you see in smaller cities, or in particularly in Midwestern cities, is this idea that you have one business that starts, and then one of the co-owners or person for that starts another business, and then that person starts another business, kind of the way tech does it, but on a much smaller scale. But I think it really does help to develop that kind of ecosystem of business owners in in a community that can rely on each other. So, and you see that in Oakland quite a bit as well. So, I mean, I think there's some avenues out there, but, you know, Earl might have some different thoughts on it than I.
Please, Mr. Hutchinson, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah. I mean, this is a whole, you can always on one, I have to tell you. And actually, the time is well spent because it's really critical. Let's just take a minute looking at African American businesses. We know the overwhelming majority of them are still, in 2021, mom and pop. Single, one or two, usually owner operator. We know that the majority of them, they're certainly not in the major financial areas, or they're primarily service in retail industries. So you have a lot of small mom and pop restaurants, a lot of small mom and pop stores, a lot of small mom and pop, just about everything in our community. So right away, there's an inherent possibility and an inherent problem. Small, as you know, oftentimes, particularly in the business world, is usually at the back of the bus, usually the last considered. We certainly have now with the PPP programs, the major controversy about who's getting the money. The big guys get theirs first. We know that because it's structured for them. But now what happens to the small mom and pop African American owned businesses in our community? We talk a lot about patronizing them, Black consumers, Black purchasers going into Black owned businesses specifically and buying from them. That's great. But that leads to another issue. Are the services going to be there? Are the products going to be there? So that's another issue. The third thing is no business is going to succeed, especially a small one, without capital reserves. See, oftentimes what happens with African American owned business people, they have a great idea. I'm a great cook. I can make great gumbo. I can make great waffles. I can make this. I can make that. So open up a business. But there's a problem with that. The problem is once you open a business, you got to market it. You have to have capital to sustain that. You have to promote it. You have to have a business plan. You have to have accounting and someone to keep your books. One of the reasons why so many Black could not qualify for the PPP program is because the books were in shambles. They didn't have all the required record keeping. So there's a checklist of things that we have to do to make and ensure African American owned businesses, the small ones, grow from being, well, first of all, that they stay in business, and secondly, sustain themselves. What we're going to do is, when I say we, the Los Angeles Urban Policy Roundtable, my organization, we're having a discussion now with Wells Fargo. And what they have done is Wells Fargo is the biggest funding nonprofit, or they have their nonprofit foundation around. They're even bigger than Walmart. So they're going to commit in Southern California, and those that are interested in entrepreneurship or have businesses should know this, and it's going to be announced in another month or so. They're going to begin funding more, targeting more African American owned businesses, small businesses, targeting them with grants and loans, low interest loans. So they've asked a panel of us to facilitate that and to help and identify and target African American owned businesses. They're going to do something else. We also urge them to do this: mentoring programs, workshops that you fund to bring young African American potential entrepreneurs to the table, mentoring them, walking through all the checklists of things that it takes to start a business and stay in business. So we're going to be emphasizing these things in the coming weeks. And we're very excited about that because we know foundational in our community are Black-owned businesses and maintaining and supporting them. And we intend to be on the point on that.
I think you froze. Okay, so I just want to make sure you were done with your comments. Thank you so much. We are getting a number of questions in here, and a couple, 2-3 of them revolve around reparations for Black folks, specifically in Santa Monica. And I know that is some would feel controversial idea. Some say it's absolutely out of the question. Others have said it's impossible to determine how to do it. And one of the things that is noteworthy about Santa Monica recently is the reports that have been generated about the level of housing exclusion, the covenants and gentlemen's agreements and zoning that led to a serious difference in terms of who lived where decades ago, and contributed to displacement, if not displacement, the inability of Black folks to buy homes, which most experts will say is one of the first steps towards building a financial legacy for your family and for your children. So do you have any comments about the idea of reparations, the consideration of that in a city like Santa Monica, where there has been displacement of Black folks, loss of community, inability to buy housing, restrictions or limitations on businesses being able to start? It's a thorny issue. Would either one of you care to comment?
I could say a couple things.
Well, actually,
Go ahead.
Okay. I had a question, Dr. Gunn.
Yes.
I have a question for you about that, if I may ask you. In the city, because I don't know, in the city of Santa Monica, have you gone during the budget process, have you gone to the city, all the officials, and said, look, you mentioned about the housing disparity, you see that all over, but specifically Santa Monica. When the budget committees are together and they're penciling together the monies for this program and that, are you suggesting that, look, maybe creating a special fund with resources, putting the money there to essentially address this particular issue? Maybe a special fund to provide low-cost loans, low-cost financing, low-cost grants or those who want to be homeowners. I'm just asking, have you done that? Because, see, that ties into reparations, because that could be a form of it. Are you doing something special for us with the budget?
Well, you know what? The discussion about housing, affordable housing, the right to return has come up as a consideration for people whose families were displaced either because of these housing restrictions and neighborhood and community protectiveness, if you will. And so that discussion is happening. And, you know, our council is considering our budget. I don't want to speak for what it is A to Z that the city is trying to do or paying attention to, but it is worth considering what you're suggesting, that might be a point for us to start with or to continue to explore. Ms. Smith, what were you going to add to that?
Well, first of all, what Earl said was a great point, because I do think that, you know, this idea of reparations is definitely should come from a government entity that we all, you know, pay taxes into. But what I was going to say is what I think is particularly interesting about what Compton's doing with the Compton Pledge, its guaranteed income project, is that the idea of guaranteed income has kind of come full circle back into people looking at it as reparations. Like in, you know, they're looking at it as a way of uplifting people that have been, you know, hurt by the system for all of the reasons that systemic racism and reasons that we know. And so I do think there is more of an interest in reparations, though, again, I think sometimes politically speaking, it comes back to the wording of it. I mean, is it guaranteed income? Is it reparations? Is it, you know, what do you call it? What's the most politically palatable way? I mean, and I think that that's, you know, important to consider, but I do think it's not an unreasonable ask. And I think that we're seeing with the stimulus checks that went out, I think people are understanding what that could potentially do. It's just kind of what you do beyond that. But I do think, to what Earl said, the idea of doing a specific fund set aside in the budget to address these issues, whether it's, you know, housing affordability, whether it's business development, all of these things that are on the agenda is probably worth considering, I would think.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to see if I can hit on a couple, 2, 3 more questions and even take us in a bit of a different direction. Someone said that Gandhi stated a nation's greatness is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. In this case, the person is interested in the Black LGBTQ youth community that suffers significant effects of being disowned by their families, resulting in homelessness, abuse, and death. Much of this intolerance is credited to religion. The question is, how can we do better? And so I would add on to that, what maybe or surely does the Black agenda advocates need to think about in terms of this issue?
Well, speaking of somebody who's a member of the LGBT community, I mean, I think it's, the mental health aspect of that is really important. And I think it's really become important given the fact that we've all been kind of on lockdown for the last year. I mean, so much of what you go through when you come out, particularly if your family is not supportive, is relying on your friends, relying on your chosen family. And if you are a person that hasn't been able to do that, if you've been cut off from your networks, if you've been told that you should stay home, or all of these other things, it really does hurt mental health, and it really does have an effect. I mean, the good thing is LA County and California in general has a lot of different nonprofits and organizations that's their mission, is to help people in the LGBT community. And so I don't know, and this is a question that I don't know what the resources are available in Santa Monica, but maybe it's worth building some of these partnerships to build it out. I mean, I know that last year after George Floyd, the LA Pride tried to do some stuff with Black Lives Matter, which kind of went sideways, but I do think there's an interest there in trying to build a partnership. Again, the LGBT community, there's, racism within that. And there's always been this back and forth between Black LGBT community and, just white LGBT folks. So there's some tension there, but I still think there's some room for some growth and to maybe do some partnerships to help out youth, particularly in Santa Monica, if there's not a nonprofit that's what they do in the city.
Thank you. Mr. Hutchinson, do you want to add anything to her comments?
Yeah, I will. I think the fundamental problem we're talking about LGBT, going back even in time to the ostracism within our community, we've been very hardline in African American communities, going back in time about those of, let's just say, a different gender preference, in this case, sexual preference. And now, of course, in modern times, we say LGBT. And so what's happened is a lot of family members have looked down on those that have come out with a different sexual orientation. They made them feel different. They've ostracized them. They've almost driven them out of the families. A lot of that is driven by, religion and the Black church. And they're misreading, I might add, of the Bible. We know that. And so that has created a lot of stress, a lot of tension, a lot of what we call now mental health problems, caught between two worlds. I'm Black, but I have a different sexual preference. But I can't stop being Black, nor can I stop having that different sexual preference. So it does wind up, unfortunately and tragically, as a mental health issue. But I think the foundational thing, and here's the good news, from every poll and every survey I have seen with the passage of time, we're seeing a much more tolerant, more enlightened, much more openness to someone in the family, an associate or a friend that has a different sexual orientation. And I think that's the good news going forward. And I think that's foundational to build on that in terms of saying you're part of the family. We respect that, your identity. We love you just the same. There's no change here. We don't look at you out of the corner of our eyes. We don't gossip. We don't mumble. We don't do any of those things. And I think once you create that loving environment, you almost take the mental health challenges, stress, strain, and breakdowns out of that. Just make people feel that they're wanted and a part of you. And I think once you do that, we're well on the road to a lot of what we really need is healing and recovery, not just in terms of LGBT, but I got to tell you, in terms of a lot of us too, for a lot of different things that we suffer from in terms of our traumas.
Well, thank you for that. And in fact, it's interesting because Ms. Fields' spoken word really spoke in many ways to the importance of self-care because of the trauma and the racism and systemic injustices that the community faces. We had a question. People were interested in what either one of you or both have as examples of successful social change efforts or places where there's a demonstration that social change has occurred or social justice is happening. Now, Ms. Smith mentioned Compton, the idea of that guaranteed income as one example. Do either of you have any other examples that people could then go and look at because they're doing it right, they're rocking and rolling in a good way, or the way that they are doing things portends to be leading us in a good direction? Either one of you got suggestions about strategies or success stories that you can share with people that are here?
I have one. Erica, do you, one that came to mind?
I feel like you should take this one first.
Go for it, Mr. Hutchinson, please.
Okay, well, Mayor, City of LA, Mayor Garcetti, about a month ago, he vetoed the budget. Now, the mayor usually doesn't do that. The budget is usually rubber stamp. He vetoed the part of a budget from the LA City Council because what he didn't like was I think it was $100 million that's earmarked for racial justice initiatives. Now, you asked about an example. So he got some pushback from that. The attack was, well, you're vetoing the budget because it's really the LAPD. Their budget's going to be cut, and you're trying to save them. The Police Protective League and the police unions, they're on you. Don't take a penny out of our budget and give it to somebody else. We had a conversation about that, and he said, that's not true. That's not why I vetoed it, not to bolster like the LAPD needs any more money. That's not why. It wasn't specifically earmarked and targeted for specific programs in each district. So he laid them out, and I laid out a few things too. For example, the issue of gang violence. When you're talking about taking a certain amount of money and bringing on board gang violence prevention counselors, many of them are ex-gang members anyway, and actually having them in the community, paying them, supporting them to provide certain types of interaction and engagement with young people that essentially would be drawn into that. So the money should be earmarked there and targeted there, not just a general thing for racial justice. That's too ambiguous. So in every one of these initiatives, and I like that, and there were checklists of 7 or 8 things that were laid out. I thought that was a good step forward. And by the way, a good model for other city governments too, to have a racial justice initiative program built into your budget and specific programs as a part of that you lay out. It could be low cost housing. I don't know. It could be anything. Could be zoning. You mentioned that before. Could be redlining, combating these kinds of things. So I think that would be the thing that I would look at. Find the model in city government, the budget, gearing it or reorienting it toward racial justice initiatives, and then spell out what those initiatives are. And one other thing, put a dollar sign along with it.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Smith, would you add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I think of this came out of Sacramento recently, which it basically did away with single family zoning, Earl mentioned zoning, which reminded me of this. And the reason that's important is because it allows people to build more housing, basically, on lots, and potentially alleviate some of the homelessness problem that we have. Now that, from my understanding, that initiative came about in part because of a coalition, including some of the more leftist activists, tenants' rights groups. Some of the folks have been pushing for a local rent control measure, which hasn't gone anywhere, a number of racial justice groups. So it was a coalition of several people on the left that pushed the city council to do this. And it's a landmark for California because no other city, from my understanding, and don't quote me on this, but I believe no other city has actually taken on single family zoning in this way. And so it could present a model for the rest of the state and other cities if they actually choose to do away with that, which would be a lot harder in Southern California than I think in parts of Northern California. But I think that's one example of something that did make a difference. It can pay some dividends down the road in terms of getting people housed.
Well, that's very interesting, and I'm going to take the risk of saying that this idea about single-family housing zoning probably has just taken the oxygen out of the air in some people's rooms that are sitting here in Santa Monica. I believe it might give them the heebie-jeebies if any of the initial signs are there. So, it's something to think. Thank you so much.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Give them the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, heebie-jeebies. That's like, some of the other things from the Spectrum commercial, like we've heard them before. One person asked about something, and I'm going to answer this, about where is there a listing here of businesses, Black-owned businesses in the city of Santa Monica. The city itself has begun to create a list of that, so I'm going to answer that for you. And I believe the Chamber of Santa Monica has also begun to try to compile that list. Those of us who are business owners, I think I could say tongue-in-cheek, would suspect the list is still relatively small. Many of us are sole proprietors. That's why, as Mr. Hutchinson was talking about in terms of the help with the stimulus response, so many Black-owned businesses are sole proprietorships, hard to qualify for that kind of stimulus support. And certainly then we had to worry about whether or not we were going to get it from the Employment Development Department, which has its own struggles. But let me go on to another question. And this was someone who was talking about non-BIPOC friends, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So then I'm going to assume this person is referring to white folks. This person stated that he felt the Black community didn't have true leaders to represent our best interests. In other words, we're missing people, the likes of MLK, Malcolm X type folks. Do you have any comment about that in terms of the current state of affairs for us as a community? When I say us, Black people particularly, as a group, as a community, are we missing leaders, or do we need to inform people? I see both of y'all shake. Errol is shaking, is scratching his head, and Erica is shaking her head. So you know what, Errol, I'm gonna let Erica go first on this one. I'll come back to you.
Well, it'll be really short. No, I think we have plenty of leaders. I think, if anything, I think we get people that pop up at the wrong time to try to be a leader and step on somebody else's foot. But I would say in this leadership, I mean, the three main founders of Black Lives Matter are right here from California. And they, they're the reason why we were so able to, take that moment after George Floyd and to pivot to some of these bigger policy issues that we're still discussing that, have led in some ways, I imagine, to the Black agenda here in Santa Monica. So I think we have plenty of leaders. It's just, our leaders don't look the way they did in the 60s. I mean, this is 2021. So look to Twitter.
There you go. Thank you. Mr. Hutchinson, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, well, I was laughing because, the questions come up a gazillion times over the year about the quote unquote Negro leader. I mean, who is the leader? Oh, and I laugh because every time the question comes up, and it comes up a lot, no one ever asks, who is the white leader? No one ever asks, who is the Asian American leader? No one ever asks or expects that there would be a Hispanic American leader. Now, I'm not talking about notables and personalities and named people. The leader. The only group that's ever been asked is Black folk. Who is the leader? And every time I hear that, I say, oh, my God. Look, a leader can be anybody. A leader can be Dr. Karen Gunn, you're a leader. I mean, come on. You know, you work in Santa Monica, you got a constituency out there, you're on the point, you're a leader. I mean, come on. Anybody can be a leader. If you're an educator and you're educating, you know, you're actually on the point in the schools, working with young people, the kids, administrators, and advocates, you're a leader. You know, if you're a bus driver, if you're a sanitation worker, and you're doing something in the community and you're touching people, engaging people, you know, raising the consciousness, you're a leader. In other words, we have to redefine who a leader is and what a leader is. No, this is not 1965. You're not going to have another Dr. King and a Malcolm X. That was a unique period, a very tiny, unique period, our history. And the conditions grew them and built them. We don't have that anymore. We've got generations that are removed from them and the movement that built them. I mean, King was built by a movement. You know, I mean, it had to. So the thing about it is, we know Black Lives Matter came out, and we knew that there were a lot of young people. Many of them, nobody knew who they were, but they came forth, they stepped forth, they provided leadership. So fine, they're the leaders. Leaders have to come from inside a community, and they have to. They're not, you know, they're not made. They're not cloned. I mean, there's not a genetic factory to make leaders. They come out of the times and the circumstances, and that's how it develops. So again, when you talk about leadership, we're going to see a lot of diversity and diversion across the board in terms of who a leader is and when they lead. Sometimes when they step up, when there's an issue, they will step forward. So, but I do want to say one other thing on that. I'm not totally unmindful, though, of the need to have some individuals that have some knowledge of the past, framing how to become a engaged advocate, and that comes from experience. And you know, we tried to build somewhat of a coalition, a Black leadership coalition, not presuming to speak for everybody or across the board, but at least when issues come up, that we can bring a small coalition of people from different groups together. And we can speak as one voice on that and be our community advocates, or at least another advocate in the community. So I think there's room for both. Leaders that come out of issues that come out and from a particular time and place, and also to maybe a more formalized structure of a small leadership coalition. So I think there's room for both.
So thank you. And, you know, here's an interesting question, and it's one that I struggle with in my work, and I think we have talked about in the Black Agenda, how do we handle this? And it kind of even piggybacks on the previous question you responded to in terms of non-BIPOCs thinking that there are no leaders and asking the question, where are there? It's like, where's Waldo? You know, it's, you know, what kind of question is that? And this question is, how can white allies support our Black community better in Santa Monica? And I wonder if either one of you can riff on that. I have some answers myself, but I'd like to hear what you think about building white allies. And I will preface it with authentic white allies, because I think there is a substantial difference between those that speak the words and don't walk the talk. Would either one of you want to respond to that? You all are deferential to each other, so I'm gonna point in Mr. Hutchinson and say go with it, and then I'll come back to you, Ms. Smith.
All right. Okay. Yeah, and that's another question that comes up over and over again. Goes all the way back deep into American history. White allies. What role do they have? I mean, that tore up the movement in the 60s. As you know, the Black Power movement said, no, we can't have young whites coming in trying to tell us what to do, dictate with all subtle racism and blah, blah. I've heard that a lot. And that's still there. We can't be unmindful of one thing. There is, and we use this a lot these days, over and over again, and I think it's a valid point when we deal with white allies around specific issues, white skin privilege. Unfortunately, the history of America, past and very much present, they're dividing line. And many whites that are well-meaning, that are extremely well-meaning, that really want to help and want to get involved, there's still just a little bit of element of disconnect of not having the experience there. And the more honest ones will tell you, I don't know what it's like to be black. I don't know what it's like to be spread eagled on the ground. I don't know what it's like to be, denied a loan. I don't know what it's like to be shuffled off on the job. I don't know any of that stuff. I mean, that's not me. That's not our background because of white skin privilege. So there is a bit of a barrier there. Now, can it be overcome? Yes. It was certainly overcome in the 60s with the civil rights movement. White allies across, matter of fact, even going back before that to the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass and white abolitionists. So again, all throughout American history, you've always had whites that have stepped up to the plate, that have been willing to engage and be willing to be involved and willing to listen and learn. And in addition to that, take direction and be a good follower, not just step out in front, but step back a minute and say, okay, it's an issue of racial justice and equity. We'll let you take the point on that, and we're here in a support capacity. And we also want to do where we can, even more than support, be it financial or just engagement in whatever level. So I think there's always going to be a room back to that original question about coalitions. Why would we exclude anybody that's well-meaning, well-intentioned, and is willing to get in the trenches and do the work? I mean, there's not a lot of people that's going to do that anyway, no matter what color. So when you find them, you better jolly well use them.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Smith, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with white allies, and to your point, real white allies, people who are humble enough to understand what they don't know, I think a couple things. One, I think that those folks can really talk to other white people about how to get them to where they are. I think that there's a conversation that can happen between two white people, like a conversation that could happen among two black folks, that doesn't necessarily translate as well. And I think that there is an ability, once you find those folks that are humble allies, to be able to go out and talk to other white people. So frankly, we don't have to do it. And I also think that there are rooms and places and bridges that can be built that, some of these more humble white allies can do and get us, who can follow, but also know when to lead in order to let us follow. And it's a symbiotic partnership. And so I think that there are ways that white allies can do it. But I think the biggest thing is to understand, not become so egotistical that, you think you know what you're doing and everything, and telling people, and we saw a lot of that, over the summer and into the fall, and it's been that way for years. But I also think that there are a lot of people who perhaps may be more willing to listen now than they were before.
Okay, thank you so much. We're kind of rapidly reaching our bewitching hour, and no disrespect to covens out there. So before we move into that closing part, because I want to make sure everyone that's in attendance will have a chance to answer those three questions, there was a question about whether or not people can get a recording of this event, and I've been told by the city staff that those who are in attendance will receive that. There are a lot of questions that we could not get to, and I hope no one will take personal offense. Some of them are very complicated, which means that it gives us an idea in terms of our next one, what we might want to focus on. Some of them have to do with divestment interests. Some of them have to do with housing, which is a real big deal in Santa Monica. And so I would like to give Ms. Smith and Mr. Hutchinson a chance to throw any parting comments out to us, anything you would suggest to us, ideas, kick us in the butt so we get going in the right direction. What would you say is a parting shot after hearing some of the questions and considerations from you as well as your fellow speaker? Ms. Smith, you're there, so I'm going to hit you first.
Well, just from scrolling through some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, I think there seems to be a lot of desire to have some specific marching orders, so to speak, or things that people can do right now, even if it's small. And I think that that's part of kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, making sure everybody's on board and building, these coalitions and having some momentum. So I think that, I think people would like to see, and frankly, I'd love to hear kind of specific things that, how people can get involved.
Okay, sounds great. And maybe we'll be able to twist your arm and you might be able to come back and sit with us again. So I certainly appreciate, and on behalf of the city of Santa Monica, as well as the Black Agenda specifically, express my appreciation, our appreciation for your taking time out to be with us. And let me now turn to Mr. Hutchinson and see if you have any parting remarks as well. Any suggestions, comments, thoughts? We'd love to hear it.
I think the key word is always engagement and involvement at whatever level. I get criticized in many times over the years. We do a lot of the press conferences, the activism in the street, press conferences, this and that. Not as much anymore. We've been up there, so I'm trying to, get younger people, get out there and do what we used to do. But, if an issue comes up, for example, like police abuse, police after a shooting, we may go out and call a press conference with a couple of the activists out there, put a position down, and invariably someone will say, well, wait a minute, there they go chasing the camera again. There they go out there trying to get their mug in front of, the press again on this. Why aren't you out there talking about black gang violence, blacks killing blacks? Here's my response to them every time. By the way, I don't remember seeing you out there calling your press conference talking about that. I don't remember you out there standing in front of a mother or a family. I don't remember you out there that's just lost someone because of violence. I don't remember you out there sending a press release. I don't remember you out there giving a nickel, a contribution to some of the anti-violence groups out there. Are you doing any of that? I mean, if you're doing that, then fine. You can criticize me or anybody else. But the point I'm making is this. At whatever level that you feel that you can make a contribution, engagement and involvement, not looking at what Earl is doing or what Dr. Gunn is doing or Eric is doing, ask the question, what are you doing? There's a lot of power in individuals, empowering yourself. I know it's a hackneyed term, but I think there's something to that. So we always encourage people, be your own advocate.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hutchinson. Same thing to you. I said to Ms. Smith. We really appreciate your being here on behalf of the city and the Black Agenda. Your wisdom and expertise is really appreciated. You took the time to share, and we may come back at you again and see if you would contribute. I hope you'll stick around for the next, both of you, for the next 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to turn to the members of the audience because we have a 3-question poll. So we're going to try to give you about 30 seconds, so you're going to have to think fast. Think fast, but the questions are easy. If you would go to the poll, one question is going to be about your interest in attending a similar event. The other is about how you would rate this one and the value of this one. So I'd like to ask everyone to go into the poll now. The questions occur one by one. They're in a sequence, so they're not all there at one time. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes. People can take a break who are presenters and others, and we'd like you to complete the poll. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to see it just above where the Q&A icon is. So we're going to take about 4 or 5 minutes just to let that happen. Don't linger too long. Thank you. I'll give you another few seconds on this question, and then we'll post the second one. Let's move on, Delana, if you're ready. Let's switch to the second question. Thank you. Oh. All right, so I just got a message from Delana that the questions are done. So thank you so much for that. It'll be very helpful. And let me remind everyone again that the event has been taped. We will send something to the attendees. I'm going to let the city staff arrange that. That's not my strong suit. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over, and I need to introduce briefly Mr. Nat Travis, who's going to offer up some closing remarks. And so those of us who know Nat, as was mentioned earlier, he's a trailblazer, he's a groundbreaker. He is called Mr. Santa Monica. I tend to call him Mr. Everywhere because that's where he is. I'm happy to turn it over to Mr. Nat Travis for the closing remarks. Hit it, my brother.
Thank you, Karen. I think that this is the first of a series of courageous conversations, and I want to attend. I was very, very pleased. You know, I'm an optimist. That's part of my blood. And George Floyd plus COVID-19 allowed America a chance to revisit a very serious problem with our diverse community. And in my opinion, the city of Santa Monica stepped up and responded in a highly positive manner with unanimous votes to the city council to move forward a civilian police review board for this city. And that decision was like one of your speakers mentioned about the Compton decision. That decision will lead this city nationally in doing the right thing. We will be deliberating, or at least the council will be deliberating on 11 appointees to that commission. We're working with the police department hand in glove, working with the Police Protective League, the union, and the civilian review. And I'm a simple thinker. I've been around this city since 1949. I've seen all of the racial problems that existed in the city, and we're fortunate enough to try to help change some things. As a mayor of the city in 75, I made certain that every board and commission had a person of color on it for the first time in the history of the city. And it's very important to get decision makers in positions of sharing their information. Granted, we have a long way to go, but I listened carefully to Earl Ofari Hutchinson and Erica Smith, both highly respected thinkers. And some of your ideas are, in fact, doable. We need to have a coalition of thought. And that's what I think Barry Snell and his Black Agenda people are doing. We're reaching out. For example, you talked about the housing. We're going to be presenting to this community a model of discussion about housing. I'm a member of the Chamber Board of Directors, the Chamber of Commerce. We're going to be working on Black businesses having access in non-typical places for Black businesses. 40% of the city's income in this town comes from tourism. So when I go to the pier, do I want to see certain restaurants? I want to see all kinds of restaurants, including restaurants that represent diversity. I heard the discussion. I listened carefully. You talked about Blacks being able to support themselves in Black communities by going to the store and doing things like that. Well, we all know that Black people have talent. Black people helped put the first person on the moon. We have a story that I'm going to close on. I'm a clock watcher. There's a school in this town called New Road School that yours truly had the honor of being the founding board chair. And we designed that school with an educator by the name of Paul Cummins, highly educated, published, etc. We designed the school to welcome students of all kinds, colors, and shapes. Our first graduate, one of our first graduates, came in there in a wheelchair. And she was the daughter of a maintenance worker at the school. And she graduated and went to UC Berkeley, the first member of that class, that family, to go to University of California. The story that's well published now about Amanda Gorman is Amanda and her sister are twins. They came to New Road School as in the K class, went all the way up and graduated. And let me just say this, Amanda's twin sister, cum laude UCLA, go Bruins. Amanda went to Harvard. I don't need to talk about Amanda because you and the world know about Amanda. But I want to say this conversation is just the first, and I watched the board. You had at a peak, I think, about 212 people, including your presenters, and that's wonderful. Thank you very much for coming. City of Santa Monica appreciates it, and I'm just putting in a plug. We have a city council listening to us. Thank you very much.
So let me wrap it up. Thank you, Mr. Everywhere, Mr. Nat Travis. I want to say thank you again to everyone that's been here for this event, those that helped to make it happen, those that are a member of the Black Agenda. And I'm going to end with some of the words that I used at the start of my segment. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. Thank you so very much. Have a good evening, and I hope you'll join us again. Take care.
Bye.